She's just paid help, nothing more." My sister's voice floated across the champagne-scented air, soft enough to sound elegant, sharp enough to slice through my composure. Crystal-clinked laughter followed. We were standing beneath the gold chandeliers of the Donovan family's Manhattan penthouse, just minutes before the countdown to New Year's Eve. I was holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, not because I worked there, but because Vanessa thought it was funny. She wanted to feel useful, she'd told the caterer. I should have left, but instead I smiled, setting the tray down, as if her cruelty were nothing but background noise. What she didn't know was that just a few miles away, screens were already lighting up with a story that would rewrite everything she believed about who held the real power. That night wasn't the first time Vanessa reminded me of my place. It was just the last time I let her. Growing up, I was the quiet one, the fixer. While she inherited charm and the family business, I inherited responsibility. Our father, Arthur Donovan, founder of the investment firm Donovan & Pierce, used to joke that Vanessa had the vision and I had the endurance. "She'll build the empire," he said. "You'll make sure the lights stay on." I was too young to realize that was a warning disguised as a compliment. My sister learned early that appearances ruled the world. I learned that someone had to clean up the messes those appearances left behind. By the time we reached our 20s, Vanessa was already being featured in financial magazines for modernizing our father's firm. I was managing small restructuring projects out of a co-working space in Chicago, scraping by trying to help struggling businesses survive. "Cute," she once said when I told her I'd saved a neighborhood bakery from closing. "You should come home, work under me. I'll find something you can handle." That was her brand of affection, condescension polished into civility. I thanked her and declined. I didn't want her mentorship. I wanted my independence. Independence came at a price. I remember nights when I slept in my office wrapped in my coat because the heating was unreliable. Clients paid late or not at all, and I lived off coffee and quiet defiance. My company, Eco Revive, was small then, just me, and an intern who believed we could make businesses both sustainable and solvent. Investors ignored us. Banks laughed at our pitch decks, but the businesses we helped didn't. Word spread. A failing cafe in Detroit cut waste and doubled profits. A small textile factory in New Jersey avoided layoffs after we renegotiated contracts. Within 2 years, our clients started referring to me as the woman who saves companies. The irony was delicious. My sister saved her image. I saved livelihoods. Still, at family events, none of that mattered. Every December, our parents hosted the same extravagant party at the penthouse. Silver dresses, jazz bands, senators and CEOs sipping imported scotch. Vanessa would glide through the room like royalty, and I, ever the dutiful daughter, would smile and pretend I belonged. But that year something in me had changed. I wasn't the same woman who accepted silence as survival. I had just signed a contract that would put Eco Revive on the national stage, a government-funded initiative for green business recovery. It was the deal that would make us a powerhouse. But I hadn't told anyone. Not yet. When I walked into the party, the first thing I noticed was Vanessa's laughter echoing across the room. She looked flawless, in a silver gown surrounded by investors and reporters, her fiancé Ethan beside her like a trophy accessory. "Claire," she said, spotting me, "you made it. I wasn't sure your little consulting thing gave you nights off." I smiled, the kind of smile that hides an entire war behind it, only for family. She leaned closer, perfume sweet and suffocating. "Don't wander too close to the investors. All right, they're here for business, not charity." I could have walked away. I almost did. But her words landed like embers on dry wood. I'd spent years watching her take credit for our family's legacy, while dismissing the work I built from nothing. Tonight, that ended. Vanessa raised her glass, gathering attention like a performer who never tired of the stage. "To another successful year for Donovan & Pierce," she declared, "to legacy, loyalty, and the people who know their place." Eyes turned toward her, then toward me. Laughter followed, polite but poisonous. My mother's nervous smile tried to smooth over the awkwardness. My father avoided my gaze. I kept still, heartbeat steady. What none of them knew was that I'd been invited to Forbes's New Year edition feature Young Innovators Redefining Business. They hadn't told me when it would publish, but I suspected soon. Very soon. As the night deepened, the conversations blurred into white noise investors boasting old money, gossiping, champagne flowing like water. I slipped out onto the balcony for air, the winter wind biting through the silk of my dress. Manhattan shimmered below, a city built on ambition and amnesia. Behind me, laughter drifted through the glass doors, Vanessa's voice the loudest of them all. She'd always mistaken cruelty for confidence. I used to think silence was strength, but silence is only power when it's chosen. That night, I wasn't silent. Ethan came out to join me, coat draped over his shoulders. "She went too far," he said quietly. "Don't take it personally. You know how she gets." I turned to him, the city lights reflecting in his glass. "She humiliates me for sport," I said. "You don't call that personal?" He hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. "She's under pressure. The SEC's been sniffing around the firm. You know how fragile image is in our business. That caught my attention." "What do you mean, the SEC?" He realized he'd said too much, backpedaling. "It's nothing, just routine checks." Then he disappeared inside, leaving me alone with a spark of suspicion that would soon grow into a blaze. When I went back in, Vanessa was holding court again, telling a story about the time I tried to run a business out of a garage. The crowd laughed. I stood by the bar watching the seconds tick toward midnight. My reflection in the mirror behind the liquor bottles didn't look like the woman she was describing. My hair pinned sleek, my gown gold, and understated my expression, calm, too calm. I wasn't her joke anymore. At 11:59, Vanessa called for attention again. Before the countdown, she said a toast to those who know their worth and those who think they do. Glasses rose. I didn't lift mine. I looked past her to the massive TV screen mounted behind the stage where the feed from Times Square played. The crowd chanted 10-9-8. My phone buzzed in my clutch. A message from Emily Rhodes' Forbes editorial. "It's live. Congratulations, Claire. You're our cover story." 765. I opened the message and saw the cover glowing on my screen. Claire Donovan, the youngest self-made billionaire of the year. 4-3. I looked up. The TV behind Vanessa flickered as the feed cut to a live news break. The Forbes cover filled the screen. My name, my face, the gold dress I was wearing right now. 2-1. The room went silent. Champagne froze midair. Vanessa turned slowly, her smile collapsing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. And as the crowd began to murmur, voices mixing disbelief with awe, I whispered into the stunned air, "Happy New Year, Vanessa." The morning after the Forbes cover dropped, Manhattan looked different. Even the January wind felt charged, humming through the glass towers like it carried my name. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn, missed calls from reporters, messages from old clients, congratulatory emails from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. I sat at the small kitchen table in my apartment, barefoot, coffee gone cold, staring at the headline again. Claire Donovan, the youngest self-made billionaire of the year. Under it, the tagline glowed, "The woman redefining business ethics in a broken economy." I'd read it a dozen times already, but it still didn't feel real. The silence broke with the ring of another call. Jake. His voice was half amused, half amazed. "You do realize you broke the internet, right?" he said. "Number Forbes Queen, number Eco Billionaire, number Donovan Dynasty, all trending. Vanessa's PR team is drowning." I leaned back, watching the winter sun streak across my countertop. "Good," I said. "Let them learn what exposure feels like." He hesitated. "You're not worried about blowback?" "She's got money, lawyers, friends in every boardroom from Boston to DC. She also has an SEC case with her name on it," I replied. "I'm not the one who should be worried." I hung up, exhaling slowly. My reflection in the window looked both familiar and foreign, same eyes, same quiet expression, but something behind them had sharpened. For the first time, I didn't look like someone waiting for permission to matter. By 9 a.m., the article had been syndicated to every major outlet. My inbox overflowed. Partnership offers interviews, even a speaking invitation from Columbia Business School. I ignored them all and opened the one message that mattered, an email from Forbes editorial board. Claire, your story is striking a chord. Would you consider expanding on your next initiative, how you plan to use your platform to reform corporate ethics? I stared at the blinking cursor before typing back, I plan to build something cleaner than legacy. I'll let you know when it's ready. The phone rang again, this time my father. I hadn't heard his voice since before Christmas. Claire, he said, measured distant. That was quite the spectacle last night. I could hear the clink of ice in his glass, even through the phone. You mean the truth, I said. He sighed. You humiliated your sister. In front of the entire financial community. That's not how family handles conflict. Family handles conflict by covering fraud, I asked quietly. By pretending corruption is sophistication. He went silent for a long moment. You always did think too much like your mother, he finally said and hung up. The line went dead, but my pulse didn't. I set the phone down and looked at the framed certificate on my wall. Eco Revive Incorporated 2017. That piece of paper had meant survival once. Now it meant independence. By midday, the media frenzy had turned feverish. News anchors dissected my speech from the night before. Investors speculated on how Donovan and Pierce's fall would shake the markets. But what none of them knew was that my move wasn't impulsive, it was calculated. Every document, every signature, every trace of Vanessa's misconduct had already been verified. She had called me help. I'd simply taken the word literally. I helped clean her mess. At noon, Rosa burst into my office holding 2 cups of coffee and a grin that barely fit her face. You did it, boss, she said breathlessly. They're calling us the moral heartbeat of Wall Street. I smiled, taking the cup from her. Let's keep the heart beating then. She hesitated, her voice softening. Vanessa's trending too, but not the way she wants. Someone leaked that internal audit letter from the SEC. The internet's calling it karma. I took a sip. Karma doesn't leak documents. Lawyers do. The door buzzed. Jake again, this time in person. He tossed a folded newspaper onto my desk. The headline: Donovan and Pierce shares plunge 26% in overnight trade freeze. He gave a low whistle. That's not a scandal anymore. That's a collapse. I nodded. The first of many. But beneath the satisfaction, something uneasy stirred. The press was painting this as a revenge saga, and while that wasn't wrong, it wasn't the whole truth either. I hadn't wanted to destroy Vanessa. I'd wanted to dismantle the illusion that she was untouchable. There's a difference. By late afternoon, the Forbes editor Emily Rhodes called personally. Claire, she said, the public loves you. You've become the face of ethical power, but people are also asking about your family. Will you comment? No, I said simply. This isn't about bloodlines, it's about accountability. Understood, she replied. But they're digging into Donovan and Pierce fast. Someone from the inside must be feeding them. I smiled faintly. Maybe the truth finally got tired of waiting. That evening, I went for a walk through the snow-covered park near my apartment. The city was still buzzing with the story screens flashing my name in neon headlines. Strangers whispered as I passed, some smiling, some curious. A woman stopped me near a bench, her hands trembling as she spoke. You don't know me, she said, but I run a small printing shop in Newark. We almost went under in 2020. Your team saved us. I just wanted to say thank you. Her words disarmed me more than Vanessa's cruelty ever had. I squeezed her hand, warmth cutting through the cold. Keep going, I said. You're the reason I do this. When I got home, the answering machine blinked, read 5 new messages. The first was a journalist, the second a lawyer, the third a stranger. But the fourth made me stop. Claire, It was Vanessa's voice, brittle but composed. "Congratulations on your performance. I hope it was worth it. You've ruined everything our family built. I'll make sure the world remembers you not as a savior but as the woman who tore her own blood apart." A pause. Then, softer, "You think you're untouchable now. You're not." The message ended, leaving a silence so sharp it rang in my ears. I deleted it without replaying. She could spin whatever story she wanted. I had the documents, the truth, and the one thing she could never fake: integrity. I opened my laptop and began typing notes for Project Horizon, the initiative Eco Revive would launch next. The idea had been simmering for months, a digital platform connecting small businesses with ethical investors built on transparency and sustainability. It would change the way capital flowed, bypassing the greed that destroyed companies like Donovan and Pierce. The cursor blinked on the blank page. I titled the document, "Building Something That Lasts." Outside, fireworks cracked over the skyline again. Another celebration, another night of noise. But I didn't need a countdown anymore. I'd already crossed the threshold. Before shutting down, I checked one last notification, a direct message from Emily Rhodes. "Claire Forbes wants to schedule a follow-up profile. We'd like to call it From Revenge to Redemption. Let me know when you're ready." I typed back one line, "I'm not ready for redemption yet. I'm still cleaning." Then I closed the laptop, exhaled, and let the silence settle. For the first time in my life, it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The email came at 3:14 inches the morning. Jake's name glowed on my screen above a single line that made my heart slam against my ribs. "You were right. Greystone Capital doesn't exist on the SEC registry." I sat up the city outside, still asleep, lights flickering from the riverfront. The spreadsheet attached loaded slowly, rows of transactions rolling across my screen like a confession in code. Cayman Islands, Singapore, Zurich. Every payment link traced back to Donovan and Pierce, and every approval carried one signature: Vanessa's. I stared until the numbers blurred, until the air felt heavy with confirmation. I'd spent years being told I exaggerated, that I saw ghosts in boardrooms and shadows in contracts. Now the proof stared back. My sister hadn't just manipulated people, she had manipulated the market. By sunrise, the apartment felt like a war room. I spread printouts across the dining table: bank transfers, invoices, shell company filings Jake had pulled from offshore databases. Each connection formed a web thin but strong enough to strangle her entire empire. When Rosa arrived with coffee, she froze at the sight. "Please tell me that's not what I think it is." I handed her a page. "It's worse. She's been rerouting investor funds through dummy entities for years. Greystone is just one mask. There are 5 more behind it." Rosa read silently, her jaw tightening. "You could take this to the press today." "Not yet," I said. "The truth deserves structure, not chaos. We'll build the case before we light the match." At 10, Jake called from Boston. "I traced Greystone's IP logs," he said. "You won't believe who handled their digital correspondence: Donovan and Pierce's own internal servers. She didn't even try to hide it." "Arrogance always leaves fingerprints," I murmured. "Claire, this isn't just unethical. This is criminal." "I know," I said quietly. "And she knows I know now." By noon, I'd called a meeting at the office. May and Devin were already there, their faces tense. I pinned copies of the fraudulent transfers on the glass wall, each document like a weapon waiting to be used. "This," I told them, "is Project Horizon. We're not just consultants anymore. We're investigators." May frowned. "You want to go after your sister's firm? That's war." I met her eyes. "No, that's justice. We went to work like surgeons." May analyzed the fake valuations line by line, her pencil tapping in rhythm. Devin combed through procurement ledgers, highlighting every inconsistency. Rosa documented the timeline of transactions, cross-referencing with SEC filings. By the time night fell, the office floor was covered in paper and tension. "Do you think she suspects?" Devin asked, rubbing his temples. I thought of Vanessa's message from the night before, the venom disguised as control. She's too busy blaming me in public to imagine I'm studying her in private. Rosa snorted. She always underestimated you. That's her weakness. I smiled thinly. It's also my weapon. At 8, Jake arrived with a new folder. You'll want to see this, he said. One of Vanessa's junior accountants sent me an anonymous tip. Internal expenses were inflated, millions filed under consulting fees. The money trails to an account in Dubai. Guess who authorized it? Vanessa, I said automatically. He nodded. And your father co-signed one of the transfers last year. For a moment the room went quiet. Even May looked up from her screen. He knew she asked. I swallowed hard. If he didn't, he chose not to. Which might be worse. I turned away, pretending to review the documents, but the truth clawed at me. For years, I'd thought my father was simply blind to Vanessa's manipulation, not complicit in it. The realization that he'd helped her protect the illusion twisted something deep inside. Rosa broke the silence. So what now? Now, I said, we build an arsenal. Over the next week, my life blurred into a cycle of caffeine, sleepless nights, and strategic obsession. We cross-checked data, collected testimonies, and built a forensic map that connected every illegal wire transfer to Vanessa's signature. The evidence grew into something undeniable. One evening, Amira Patel, Jake's contact at the Department of Justice, joined us over video call. Her tone was clipped, her eyes sharp. If this evidence is real, you're holding a grenade, she said. Once it's public, there's no going back. Whistleblowers rarely walk away untouched. I'm not looking to walk away, I said. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Then you'd better do it right. Don't leak it. File it. Let the law carry the blade for you. After the call, May leaned back, exhaling. She's right. You're poking a lion. I smiled faintly. Then I'll make sure the lion's in a cage before I knock. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching snow gather on the streetlights. My mind replayed childhood dinners, Vanessa, charming guests while I poured wine, my father's approving nods, my mother's practiced laughter. They'd called it family tradition. I called it performance. Every laugh had been a transaction, every silence an investment, and now the debt was due. At dawn, I went into the office early. The city was ghostly quiet, the kind of cold that keeps secrets. I opened my encrypted drive and stared at the folder labeled Horizon Evidence, Verified. Each document inside carried months of my sister's arrogance, her emails, her approvals, her carelessness. And below them, my name on a separate file, whistleblower submission draft. I hesitated only once. My finger hovered over the send button as I whispered to the empty room. You built your empire on illusions, Vanessa. I'm about to show them what it's really made of. Then I pressed send. When the confirmation ping echoed, the weight lifted, not completely, but enough to breathe again. I leaned back, eyes closed, and let the hum of the city seep through the glass. By the time Rosa and May arrived, I'd already printed 3 binders, one for the SEC, one for the DOJ, and one for us. The war had officially begun. Later that afternoon, Jake called with a cautious tone. There's chatter already, he said. Someone inside Donovan and Pierce leaked that the SEC has new information. Vanessa's holding an emergency board meeting tonight. Good, I replied. Let her scramble. He hesitated. She's dangerous when cornered. So am I said quietly. That night, as snow fell over the city, I stood at my window again. The skyline glittered indifferent to the chaos brewing beneath it. Somewhere in Boston, Vanessa would be pacing, calling lawyers, spinning narratives. She'd say I betrayed her, destroyed our family. She'd call it revenge. But I knew better. Revenge is loud. Justice is quiet. I whispered into the cold air. You called me paid help. You were right. I clean messes, starting with yours. The city lights blurred like fire, and for the first time in years I didn't feel invisible. I felt inevitable. The invitation arrived 3 days later, wrapped in black cardstock and sealed with the Donovan family crest, gold leaf embossed with arrogance. New Year's Eve, Gala, Donovan Estate, Newport. Formal attire. Family attendance required. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee cooling untouched beside me. Vanessa had timed it perfectly, a desperate display to remind the world she still controlled the stage. I almost threw it away. Almost. But then I remembered her voice on that voicemail, smooth as poison. "You think you're untouchable now." Fine, I thought. Let's test that theory. By evening, I'd made up my mind. I would go not as the outcast she once mocked, but as the woman who'd just rewritten her own story on the front page of Forbes. Jake didn't like the idea. "She's going to use that gala to spin the narrative," he warned, "to make you the villain." "Then I'll show her what a real villain looks like," I said, slipping the invitation into my bag. The day of the event, snow fell soft and heavy over Newport. The estate loomed at the end of the drive like something carved out of privilege columns, marble steps, the air itself perfumed with wealth. Cameras already lined the gates. Vanessa was clearly turning the gala into a public performance. Inside, chandeliers spilled light across crystal glasses and sequined gowns. The orchestra played something expensive and soulless. I caught the first murmur within seconds. "That's her, the Forbes girl." Heads turned. Eyes followed. I smiled politely as I handed my coat to the attendant. Beneath the gold silk of my gown, my heart beat steady, not from nerves but from anticipation. Vanessa appeared near the grand staircase, dressed in midnight blue, flawless as ever. Her diamond earrings caught the light, but her smile was sharper than glass. "Claire," she purred, air kissing the space near my cheek. "I didn't think you'd come." "You sent an invitation," I said. "I assumed it wasn't optional." "Oh, it wasn't." Her gaze flicked down to my dress, then back up with a smirk. "Lovely choice. Though gold can be a dangerous color, it draws attention you might not be ready for." "I've had some practice," I said. Her laugh was a practiced melody, perfectly audible to the crowd. Of course, the youngest self-made billionaire of the year. Quite the headline. She lifted a glass of champagne. "To reinvention." For a moment I saw the flash of envy behind her eyes, the kind that eats people alive from the inside out. "Careful," I said, my tone light. "Wouldn't want to spill that. Stains are hard to remove." Her smile faltered for half a breath. "Only, I noticed. Dinner was theater." Vanessa seated me directly across from her, flanked by donors, journalists, and two politicians whose names were printed across every finance column in the country. I recognized them all. That was her strategy, use proximity to power as validation. Halfway through the first course, I caught my father's gaze from across the room. He didn't smile. He looked tired. His shoulders, once straight and commanding, sagged slightly under the weight of his silence. Mother, on the other hand, looked radiant, until I noticed the wine stain at the edge of her sleeve, the tiny tremor in her hand as she lifted the glass. I knew that look. She was holding herself together through sheer performance. When the main course arrived, Vanessa stood to make a toast. The room fell quiet. She turned slightly so her profile faced the cameras. "To family," she began, voice perfectly pitched, "and to legacy. May we continue to prove that true worth is measured not by headlines, but by heritage." A few polite chuckles rippled through the guests. Then she turned her eyes on me. "And of course to my dear sister Claire, who has made quite the name for herself this year. Some of us build, some of us reinvent." The subtext was clear. The crowd laughed softly, but enough. I smiled. "To reinvention," I said, lifting my glass. "And to the courage it takes to admit when an old empire is built on rotten beams." The laughter stopped. Forks stilled. For one perfect second, no one breathed. Then the orchestra started again, awkward and rushed. Vanessa's eyes flashed with fury. After dinner, I excused myself and stepped out onto the balcony. The cold air bit at my skin, clearing the noise from my head. The ocean stretched black and endless below the cliffs. I thought of the years I'd spent invisible in this house, cleaning up after their parties, listening to Vanessa charm senators and CEOs, while I hid behind spreadsheets in silence. Jake's voice echoed in my head. "Don't give her a stage." But what he didn't understand was that this wasn't her stage anymore. It was mine. Behind me, the glass doors opened. I didn't need to turn to know it was her. Her perfume arrived first, sharp, expensive, suffocating. "You always had a flair for drama," Vanessa said, her voice cool. "You always mistook cruelty for class," I replied. She stepped beside me, looking out at the dark sea. "You think you've won because some magazine wrote your name in gold letters. This will fade, Claire. Scandals always do." "It's not a scandal if it's true," I said softly. Her lip curled. "You wouldn't have any of this without me. Without this family." I turned to her fully then. "You're right, I wouldn't. You taught me everything I needed to know about greed, manipulation, and how to survive them both." She blinked, the confidence cracking. "You think you can destroy me?" I smiled faintly. "No, Vanessa. You're doing that yourself." She laughed, brittle and too loud. "You don't scare me, then you're not paying attention." The silence that followed was colder than the wind. She turned sharply, heels striking marble, retreating back into the warmth of her party. I stayed outside, the sound of her laughter fading behind glass. When I returned inside, the ballroom was alive again, music, laughter, flashbulbs. But I could feel the shift. Conversations hushed as I passed. Some smiled with admiration, others with fear. And then it happened. The television behind the bar flickered. The network banner rolled across the screen. Breaking news, SEC files formal inquiry into Donovan and Pierce. The room fell silent. Reporters inside the party glanced at their phones, fingers flying across screens. The anchor's voice filled the air. "The Securities and Exchange Commission confirmed late this evening that multiple accounts linked to Donovan and Pierce are under investigation for fraudulent reporting and offshore fund transfers. Sources indicate new evidence was submitted anonymously earlier this week." I didn't move. I didn't need to. The color drained from Vanessa's face as whispers swept the room like wildfire. My father's hand tightened around his glass until it cracked. Cameras flashed. Someone muttered, "This can't be real." Vanessa turned toward me, eyes wide, not with fear but disbelief. For the first time in her life, she didn't have a script. I stepped closer, voice low enough for only her to hear. "Happy New Year, sister." Her champagne flute trembled. The orchestra stumbled to a stop. Every head turned toward us. And then, as if orchestrated by fate itself, the screen changed again, Forbes breaking their special feature for the midnight segment. My cover appeared bright and undeniable. Claire Donovan, the youngest self-made billionaire of the year. The room froze. The only sound was the ticking clock as it struck midnight. I lifted my glass slowly, the gold of my dress catching the chandelier light. "To the new year," I said softly, "and to building something that lasts." No one spoke. Vanessa's smile collapsed entirely. Around us, the guests stood motionless, caught between admiration and awe, between disbelief and dread. Outside, fireworks exploded across the horizon, brilliant and deafening. But inside that ballroom, the only sound that mattered was silence, the sound of a dynasty unraveling in real time. The fireworks had barely faded when the cameras began flashing like gunfire. The New Year's Eve ballroom, once humming with polished laughter, had turned into a battlefield lined with sequins and broken silence. Vanessa stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, her glass still half raised as if refusing to accept gravity. My father's voice cracked somewhere in the background, low, furious, and useless. I didn't stay to watch the implosion. The moment I turned, the crowd parted instinctively, whispers trailing behind me like smoke. Every phone in the room was glowing. Screens reflected my Forbes cover gold dress, calm smile, headline blazing. The youngest self-made billionaire of the year. Each photo felt like a blade slicing through Vanessa's carefully stitched facade. Outside, the cold hit me like truth. The air smelled of salt and smoke from the fireworks still drifting over the bay. I could hear muffled chaos through the glass doors, the reporters, the accusations, the cracks forming in every polite smile. I almost pitied her. Almost. Jake's car was already waiting at the edge of the drive. He rolled down the window, eyes wide. "You really dropped the bomb, didn't you?" I slid into the passenger seat, the hem of my gown brushing the salt-wet floor. "Not a bomb," I said quietly. "Just a truth she couldn't bury." He chuckled, but there was awe beneath it. The SEC statement hit within minutes of the Forbes broadcast. Someone timed that perfectly. I stared out the window, watching the estate shrink in the rearview mirror. Someone did. When I reached my apartment, the city was still alive with celebration, but my world had shifted. My inbox overflowed congratulatory messages from allies, panic from former clients of Vanessa's journalists, begging for comments. I turned off my phone and went straight to the window. Across the river, fireworks painted the skyline gold and red. For a fleeting moment, I thought of the girl I'd been sitting at that same window years ago, unpaid intern, invisible sister. She wouldn't have believed tonight was possible. At 4 a.m, Rosa arrived. Her hair was messy, her coat thrown over her pajamas, but her eyes sparkled with disbelief. "Claire, you're on every network." "Every single one. CNN, Bloomberg, even the late shows. They're calling it the fall of the Donovan dynasty." I smiled faintly. Dynasties always fall. People just forget to write the chapters that lead up to it. She dropped onto the couch beside me, clutching a mug of tea. "Vanessa's PR team is spiraling. Half her board has already resigned." "She'll fight," I said. "She always does. But this time her weapon is gone, her reputation." The next morning, the war moved online. Headlines exploded across every feed. Donovan and Pierce under federal scrutiny. Investors withdraw millions as fraud allegations mount. Sister who blew the whistle, Claire Donovan, Forbes' ethical billionaire. Rosa handed me a tablet. "You might want to see this." On the screen was a live broadcast from outside the Donovan estate. Reporters swarmed like vultures. Vanessa stood at the gates, still elegant but fraying, her voice tight with denial. "These accusations are baseless," she declared. "My sister's sudden fame has clearly clouded her judgment. I wish her well, but we will not be defined by lies." I tilted my head. "She's already defined by them." Jake called minutes later. "She's calling for a private meeting," he said. "Wants to clear the air." Her lawyers reached out through back channels. I laughed softly. "Clear the air, she polluted it years ago." "She's desperate," Jake said. "But she's also cornered, and that makes her dangerous. Be careful." That evening, as dusk sank over the city, I sat in my office with the lights off, staring at the framed Forbes cover hanging opposite my desk. Beneath it sat the folder that had changed everything, Project Horizon evidence. I flipped it open, tracing the lines of transactions, the proof of deception that had lived quietly in my hands for months. It wasn't just data anymore. It was history rewritten. The intercom buzzed. Rosa's voice came through. "She's here." I hadn't expected Vanessa to come herself. When she walked in, wrapped in a black coat, she looked smaller than I remembered. The woman who once commanded entire rooms now carried her own storm. "I thought you'd send lawyers," I said. "They're waiting outside," she replied. I wanted a moment alone. For a beat, neither of us spoke. The city lights painted her face in fractured golden shadow. "You think you've won," she said finally. "I didn't play to win," I said. "I played to survive." She laughed, but it came out cracked. "Survive? You destroyed me. You destroyed our family. I exposed what you destroyed yourself." She stepped closer, her perfume sharp with nerves. "You could have come to me first. We could have fixed this quietly." "Quietly," I repeated. "Like how you fixed Greystone Capital. Like how you fixed those offshore accounts." Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand how the world works." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, voice low. "I just stopped pretending corruption is strategy." She exhaled, glancing around the office as if searching for a weak spot. "You're no saint, Claire. The media will turn on you eventually. They always do." "Maybe," I said, "but I'll still sleep at night." For the first time, her facade cracked completely. "Do you know what it's like to lose everything?" "Yes," I said softly. "You taught me." She went still. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out. The door closed with a hollow click, the kind that echoes in memory long after sound fades. When Rosa returned, she looked at me carefully. "How bad was it?" "Predictable," I said. "She's going to fight back, but not with truth, with noise." Sure enough, the next day headlines shifted again. Claire Donovan's company under ethics review. Anonymous sources claimed EcoRevive's meteoric growth was too good to be true. The smear campaign had begun. Jake called first. "She's pulling strings. Old contacts, media favors. They're planting doubt." I nodded. "Let them. You're not worried I've got more than numbers this time. I've got people." And I did. Clients, partners, even small business owners started flooding social media with stories how EcoRevive had saved their companies, their homes, their futures. Hashtags trended within hours. Number "Thank you, Claire," number "Ethical Power," number "Truth over Legacy." For the first time, I realized something profound. Revenge had momentum, but integrity had gravity. That night, I went for a walk along the Hudson. The wind off the water was brutal, but it cleared my head. Every skyscraper reflected both past and possibility. My sister had her empire of glass. I had mine of steel. My phone buzzed an unknown number. I answered out of instinct. "Claire," the voice said. Male, steady. "You don't know me, but you saved my company last year. If you ever need a witness for whatever's coming, you've got one." I smiled, the kind that starts deep in the chest. "Thank you," I said. "I might take you up on that." When I returned home, the skyline glittered like gold armor. In the distance, the Donovan Tower's lights flickered, one floor dark after another. For years, that building had been the symbol of my exclusion. Now it was proof that collapse and creation often begin at the same height. As I poured a glass of wine, I caught my reflection in the window, the same woman Vanessa had once dismissed as paid help. But tonight, under the glow of the city I had outgrown, she looked nothing like help. She looked like consequence. The subpoena landed on my desk 2 weeks later, stamped in thick black ink like a declaration of war. Request for documentation, EcoRevive Holdings and affiliated entities. Vanessa had moved faster than I expected. Her lawyers had convinced a judge to initiate a compliance review under the guise of corporate transparency. It wasn't justice. It was retaliation dressed as procedure. Rosa read the papers over my shoulder, her voice trembling. "This is a witch hunt." I folded the letter calmly. "Then we'll give them nothing to burn." I called Jake first. "She's weaponizing the courts," I said. He exhaled on the other end. "I figured she might. Her board's collapsing. She needs to drag you down with her. She's betting the press won't distinguish between investigation and guilt." "She's wrong," I replied, "but we'll still play smart." For the next 72 hours, my office transformed again, binders, stacked laptops, humming coffee gone cold, in untouched mugs. I gathered my team in the conference room, sunlight slicing across the glass walls like a spotlight. "We're going to cooperate fully," I told them. "Every file, every audit, every email. If we've done nothing wrong, transparency is our armor." Devon frowned. "Even if they twist your words, they can't twist numbers," I said. "Not if they're clean." By midnight, the walls were lined with folders. The hum of printers filled the silence like background percussion to our resolve. Rosa typed summaries. May cross-checked transaction ledgers. Jake handled communications with the firm representing us, a white shoe outfit known for surgical precision in crisis defense. Still, fatigue crept in, followed by unease. Vanessa wasn't just trying to tarnish my reputation. She was trying to exhaust me, to force me to bend under the weight of bureaucracy. At 3 a.m, May leaned back in her chair. "You ever wonder why she hates you this much?" I looked up from the spreadsheet. "Because I stopped needing her." When dawn broke, the city glowed pale silver through the office windows. I poured another cup of coffee, my reflection split across the glass, half shadow, half light. That was the thing about revenge. It wasn't just a battle of proof. It was a test of endurance. The following week brought chaos and headlines. SEC intensifies inquiry into Donovan and Pierce. EcoRevive under compliance review. Two sisters at the heart of Wall Street's moral war. Every photo paired our faces side by side as if the world had decided to turn our family into a morality play. Reporters waited outside my building. One shouted, "Miss Donovan, is it true your sister claims you used her resources to start your company?" I stopped, mid-step, meeting his gaze. "My sister's resources are illusion and debt," I said. "Mine are math and work." Inside, Jake was pacing. "You shouldn't give them sound bites like that," he said. "They twist silence too," I replied. That afternoon, the pressure cracked from another side. My father called again, first time since the gala. His voice was gravel older than I remembered. "You've started something you can't control, Claire," he said. "Your mother's falling apart. Vanessa's threatening to sue the entire family trust. Then maybe it's time that trust stopped protecting her." He sighed. "You've made your point. Enough." I clenched my jaw. "No, Dad. Enough was 5 years ago when she stole investor money and called it innovation." The line went dead before I could say more. Later that night I went home and found an envelope slid under my apartment door. No name, no return address. Inside, a USB drive and a single typed note: "If you want to see how deep her fraud goes, open this. But be ready." I plugged it into a burner laptop. Folders appeared: emails, internal chats, contracts. Proof that Vanessa's manipulation went far beyond the offshore account. She had bribed auditors, falsified compliance reports, and laundered millions through political donations. The dates matched perfectly with the years she'd claimed to be expanding operations. I stared at the screen until the text blurred. This wasn't just corporate corruption, it was criminal empire-level fraud. Jake came over within the hour. He scrolled through the files, whistling low. "Who sent this, I don't know, but whoever they are, they just handed me her confession." He looked at me, serious now. "If this leaks, it'll burn her to the ground. That's the point." He shook his head. "It won't stop there. It'll scorch everything attached to her. Your parents' old partners, even the employees who didn't know." I met his eyes. "Then we make sure it lands where it should. Targeted. Precise." We spent the next 2 days verifying every document. May cross-referenced the emails with public SEC filings. Rosa traced the bank codes to corresponding accounts. Everything checked out. By the third night, our evidence was bulletproof. At dawn, I called my attorney, Simone. She answered immediately, voice clipped but calm. "I was expecting this," she said. "If we move forward, we file with both the SEC and DOJ simultaneously. It'll be a full-scale investigation." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Do it. Then be prepared," she warned. "Vanessa will retaliate. Publicly. Brutally." "I'm counting on it," I said. By noon, the filing was complete. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, heart steady but cold. When it hit 100%, I whispered to myself, "That's checkmate." An hour later, the first leak hit the press. Not from us, but from inside Donovan and Pierce. A whistleblower had surfaced anonymously confirming the evidence. The dominoes began to fall faster than anyone expected. That evening, the television flickered with breaking news. The anchor's voice trembled slightly as she read. "The Department of Justice has opened an investigation into Donovan and Pierce following multiple allegations of fraud, embezzlement, and political bribery. Sources close to the case have confirmed the cooperation of an internal witness." Rosa gasped. "It's happening." Jake turned off the sound. "She's going to call you." And she did. The phone rang once, twice, then her voice hoarse, stripped of its practiced grace. "Claire, what have you done?" "What you forced me to," I said. "They're tearing everything apart." "Do you understand what this means for our name?" "Yes," I said. "It finally means something honest." For a moment, all I heard was her breathing. Then softly, "You think this will make you a hero? You're just a destroyer." "No," I replied. "I'm a cleaner. There's a difference." I hung up before she could answer. Outside, thunder rolled over the city, though no rain came. The air buzzed with electricity, the kind that comes before storms and change. Jake leaned against the window, arms crossed. "You just pulled the final thread," he said. "Good," I murmured. "It was rotting anyway. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of what I'd done pressed against my ribs, equal parts victory and grief. I walked to the window, watching the lights shimmer on the Hudson. Somewhere, Vanessa was probably pacing her penthouse, making frantic calls to lawyers, watching her empire crumble one document at a time. And for the first time, I didn't feel rage. I felt relief. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The girl she once called paid help had become the one thing Vanessa feared most, an equal, who didn't need her approval, and a mirror that reflected her corruption with brutal clarity. I whispered to the city, to the ghosts of every insult. You can't ruin someone who learned how to rebuild. And when the first light broke over Manhattan, I knew the war for redemption had just begun. The morning after the DOJ announcement, Manhattan felt unnaturally quiet. It wasn't silence, it was anticipation, a city holding its breath before the collapse. The newspapers at every corner stand screamed her name. Vanessa Donovan, under federal investigation. Beneath the headline, a photo of her walking out of the Donovan and Pierce Tower, chin high, sunglasses on, but her expression brittle. I sat by my window with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the footage replay on TV. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like lightning, and Vanessa's bodyguards shoved them back. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was the loudest thing she'd ever said. My phone buzzed. Rosa. Claire, it's chaos, she said breathlessly. Half the partners have resigned. The firm's offices in Boston and Chicago are shutting down. The FBI's already subpoenaed their servers. I exhaled slowly. It's faster than I thought. Vanessa hasn't been seen since last night, Rosa added. Rumor is she's hiding at your parents' estate in Connecticut. Of course she was. The same place she always ran to when things went wrong. A fortress built on denial and marble. By noon, the office was swarming. Reporters outside the building, clients inside. Everyone wanted answers. May was fielding calls from investors. Jake was coordinating statements with Simone's legal team, and I was preparing for the press conference we couldn't avoid any longer. This isn't about her anymore, Simone said firmly as we stood in the conference room. You can't let them frame this as sister versus sister. It's truth versus corruption. Make that distinction clear. I nodded. I'll handle it. When the cameras finally flashed that afternoon, I stood at the podium under the harsh white light of accountability. I did not set out to destroy anyone I began. But when truth collides with power, destruction is often collateral. What's happening to Donovan and Pierce isn't a scandal, it's a correction. The room buzzed with questions. Miss Donovan, did you expect your sister's downfall to happen this fast? Do you feel any remorse? I met their gazes one by one. Remorse belongs to those who choose silence. I chose exposure. That line would replay on every network for the next 48 hours. When the press left, the exhaustion hit. Simone squeezed my shoulder before leaving for another call. Brace yourself, she said quietly. Vanessa's not done. She'll drag you through the mud before she falls. That night it started. Anonymous leaks. Edited clips implying I'd profited off insider information. Fake text threads circulating online. The internet didn't need proof. It only needed momentum. Within hours, hashtags twisted my story. Number Golden Hypocrite trended next to number Justice for Vanessa. Rosa burst into my office waving her phone. She's feeding this. Look at the accounts, they're all linked to a PR firm in DC. She's paying trolls to smear you. Of course she is, I said. When truth fails, manipulation speaks louder. But even as I said it, my stomach knotted. I'd built my empire on integrity. Watching it questioned by strangers who didn't know me, it hurt more than I'd expected. Jake found me later, standing by the window again. You okay? I'm fine. Don't lie, he said gently. You're shaking. I looked down. My hands were trembling slightly. It's not fear, I said. It's fury. He handed me a folder. You'll want to see this. SEC just confirmed they froze all of Vanessa's personal accounts. She's got nothing left to hide behind but the family name. I stared at the papers. Then she's going to use it like a shield. Or a weapon. He smiled grimly. She always does. That evening, as I walked out of the building, I saw her face again on a massive LED screen in Times Square. A news alert looped over her photo, breaking Vanessa Donovan to hold her own press conference tomorrow morning. The caption below quoted her, "My sister fabricated everything. I will prove it." For a second, the world seemed to tilt. When I got home, my apartment was dark except for the glow of my laptop. I opened a new document, titled Response Strategy. Under it, I wrote one sentence: "Don't fight lies with anger. Fight them with evidence." Then I opened the encrypted drive again. There it was, the full data from the anonymous USB, still untouched since the filing. Emails between Vanessa and politicians, records of wire transfers disguised as campaign donations. Proof that her rot wasn't confined to finance, it reached into government. If she wanted to drag me into the light, I would bring the fire with me. The next morning, I turned on the television just in time to watch Vanessa take the podium. She looked composed, her voice calm, rehearsed. "My sister has always envied me," she said, smiling slightly. "She built her career on betrayal. Eco Revive was funded with stolen intellectual property. We'll be filing a countersuit." I felt my pulse spike, but I didn't move. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and then midway through the Q&A, she made her fatal mistake. Someone asked, "Miss Donovan, did you authorize political donations using company funds?" Her jaw tightened. "Absolutely not." 10 seconds later, I posted the first email thread. Screenshots, timestamps, the senator's name. Within an hour, it was everywhere. Forbes exclusive. New evidence links Vanessa Donovan to illegal political funding. Jake called, laughing breathlessly. "She just hung herself on live TV." "I didn't push," I said quietly. She jumped. By evening, the dominoes crashed. The DOJ expanded the scope of the case. Congressional committees called for review. Investors demanded restitution. Vanessa went silent. Completely this time. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I sat in my office long after everyone left, lights dimmed, city glowing outside the windows. The silence was heavy. When the intercom buzzed, I almost didn't answer. Rose's voice came through, hesitant. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's your mother." I froze. She hadn't called once since the gala. I almost told Rosa to send her away, but something in me said, "Let her in." My mother walked in, wrapped in a beige coat too thin for the weather. The years showed now in the lines around her mouth, the dullness in her once perfect posture. She looked smaller, fragile. "Claire," she said softly, "you've destroyed your sister." "No," I said. "She destroyed herself. She's still family. She stopped being that when she used our name to launder money." She sighed, sinking into the chair across from me. "You always were like your father, unforgiving." I met her eyes, "And you always mistook forgiveness for weakness." For a long moment, we just sat there, two women bound by blood and broken pride. Finally, she stood. "I came here to ask one thing. Don't testify in court. Let the law handle her. Don't make it uglier than it already is." I stood too. "You don't understand. I am the law now." She flinched, her eyes glistening. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. I turned toward the window again, the city alive with noise and consequence. Somewhere out there, my sister was unraveling, and in that moment I realized something terrifying. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was exposure, and exposure doesn't stop once it starts. When Jake called later that night, I didn't pick up. I needed silence. I needed to remember who I was before this war began. But the truth was clear, there was no before anymore. There was only what came next. The world now saw Vanessa as the fallen heiress, and me as the woman who brought her down. And if I was going to wear that title, I intended to make sure it meant something. The day Vanessa was indicted, rain washed over Manhattan, like the city itself was cleansing her name from its skyline. I watched from the window of my office, the clouds low and heavy, the kind of gray that swallows sound. Headlines flickered across every screen on 6th Avenue, Vanessa Donovan charged with fraud, embezzlement, and federal bribery. I didn't smile. I didn't even breathe for a while. I just stood there letting the rhythm of the rain steady me. For months I'd been preparing for this exact moment, and yet it felt strangely hollow, like watching the ending of a story I already knew by heart. Rosa broke the silence first. "It's official," she said softly, scrolling through her phone. "She's surrendered to authorities. They released the mugshot." I turned. How bad? Rosa hesitated before showing me the screen. Vanessa looked human. No perfect hair, no diamonds, no mask, just exhaustion carved into every line of her face. Jake walked in seconds later, shaking the rain off his coat. "It's done. The feds seized all her accounts. Even the Hamptons estate is under lien." I nodded slowly. "And my parents?" He hesitated. "They're not under investigation yet, but they're broke. The trust is gone. They sold the townhouse." I looked out the window again. Good. Maybe they'll finally learn what it feels like to live without illusion. That evening, I sat alone in the office long after the others left. The rain had turned to snowflakes melting against the glass before sliding away. I thought about every insult, every dinner table humiliation, every time Vanessa had called me paid help. It didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like the echo of something that used to matter. My phone buzzed. Simone's name lit the screen. "It's over," she said without preamble. "DOJ will file the plea deal by next week. She's cooperating, probably trying to cut time." "Of course she is," I said quietly. Simone paused. "There's one more thing. The prosecutors want you to testify, Claire. They say your statement will close the case." I closed my eyes. "When next Monday?" "Federal court downtown." "I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat there in the dim office, light the quiet, too full. Every piece of paper, every decision, every sleepless night had led here. But for what to stand in a courtroom and watch my sister sentenced, to see the last thread of our family unravel. By the time Monday came, the city was frozen solid, the streets glazed with winter glass. The courthouse loomed ahead like a mausoleum. Jake walked beside me, silent, the air between us thick with what neither of us could say. Inside, cameras flashed. Reporters lined the halls, whispering my name like it was both curse and headline. Claire Donovan, the whistleblower sister. When I took the stand, Vanessa was already seated at the defense table. She looked smaller than I remembered, her power drained, replaced by a fragile defiance. For a second, our eyes met. It was enough to drag 100 memories through my chest. Shared birthdays, fights over dresses, the time she'd taught me how to drive in our father's old Mercedes. The prosecutor began. "Miss Donovan, can you describe when you first discovered the falsified records?" I steadied my voice. 2 years ago. I was reviewing financial statements tied to Greystone Capital, one of my sister's subsidiaries. The data didn't match the filings. It led me to investigate further. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because no one would have believed me then. They still thought she was untouchable." The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens. I continued piece by piece, detail by detail, explaining the trail of fraud that had stretched from Manhattan to Dubai. Every word I spoke built the case tighter around her. When I finished, the prosecutor nodded. "Thank you, Miss Donovan. No further questions." Then Vanessa's lawyer stood. "You've made quite a name for yourself, haven't you?" he said smoothly. "Forbes cover media darling, self-made billionaire. Do you deny that this exposure has benefited your company financially?" "No," I said simply. "Truth has value. Some might say this case isn't about truth, it's about revenge." I met his gaze, then glanced at my sister. "Revenge ends when the guilty fall. Accountability is what comes next." He didn't ask another question. When court adjourned, I stayed seated for a moment as the crowd poured out. Vanessa rose, wrists cuffed loosely in front of her. She hesitated, then turned slightly toward me. "You got what you wanted," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said. "I got what was necessary." For a second, she looked like she might cry, but then her jaw hardened. The guards led her away, her heels echoing faintly on marble, the sound diminishing until it disappeared. Outside snow was falling again, thick and soft. Reporters swarmed microphones, flashing questions shouted through the wind. I didn't stop. Jake shielded me as we pushed through the crowd. Back at the office, the team greeted me with cautious smiles. Rosa hugged me tight. "It's over," she whispered. I pulled back slightly. "No, it's finished, but not over." Over the next week, the fallout spread. The Donovan name, once carved into the glass of every skyscraper, was scrubbed from buildings, websites, and contracts. The tower downtown that bore our name went dark. Investors backed out. Foundations we once funded issued public apologies. At night, I worked alone in the glow of my office drafting a new proposal, the Horizon Initiative, a foundation dedicated to financial transparency and ethical entrepreneurship. The idea was simple: help small business owners protect themselves from predators like my sister. Jake came in one night while I was writing. "You really think you can fix what they broke?" he asked softly. "I don't have to fix it," I said. "I just have to make sure the next generation doesn't build it wrong again." He smiled faintly. "You've changed. So has the battlefield." He leaned against the doorframe, watching me for a long time. "You know, not many people would have done what you did. Not many people had to." A few days later, Forbes reached out again. They wanted a follow-up feature. This time, they called it From Revenge to Renewal, Claire Donovan's second act. I agreed, but only if the cover didn't show me in gold. I asked for gray. Real, honest. When the article dropped, it wasn't about victory or scandal. It was about rebuilding. About how empires can rot from within and still give birth to something cleaner if someone dares to break them first. One line from the interview stuck with me: "Redemption doesn't come from apology, it comes from creation." That night, I drove north out of the city. Past the river, past the remnants of everything I'd burned down. I pulled over by a quiet stretch of road overlooking the frozen Sound. The stars were faint, but they were there. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel it: not triumph, not guilt, just peace. Vanessa would serve her time. My parents would vanish from the social calendars they worshipped. The Donovan Empire would become a cautionary tale. And me, I was still standing. Not as someone's daughter or someone's rival, but as someone who had rewritten what survival looked like. The wind howled against the car, rattling the mirror, whispering through the trees. Somewhere in that sound, I heard my sister's old words, the ones that had started it all. "She's just paid help." I smiled faintly at the irony, because maybe she was right. I had been paid help once, but now I helped the world clean itself. 6 months after the trial, the Donovan name had vanished from Manhattan's skyline. The tower that once bore our crest was now wrapped in scaffolding, stripped of its letters like a monument to arrogance, finally dismantled. The city had moved on. Headlines turned to new scandals, new billionaires, new obsessions. But for me, life had shifted into something quieter, sharper, and infinitely more deliberate. Eco-Revive had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. We had offices in 3 cities now: New York, Austin, and Seattle, and a waiting list of small businesses seeking ethical funding. Reporters called it a revolution in corporate accountability. I just called it clean business. I stood in the new Manhattan headquarters that morning, sunlight bouncing off the glass walls, watching our team prepare for the launch of the Horizon Initiative. Rosa adjusted the projector screen while May organized the folders at each seat. Jake moved through the room, calm and confident as ever. "You realize," he said, glancing at me, "this is the first time your name has been trending for something other than revenge." I smiled faintly. Progress. The presentation began at 9 sharp. Rows of investors, journalists, and community leaders filled the room. I stepped up to the podium and took a breath. When I started Eco-Revive, it was out of necessity. I wanted to create a business that couldn't be corrupted by greed. What I didn't expect was how many others wanted the same thing. I clicked the remote. The screen behind me displayed a series of faces, small business owners we'd helped in the past year. The bakery in Newark that had doubled its staff. The small-town hardware stores saved from bankruptcy. The Detroit startup now employing veterans. "These are not stories of charity," I said. They're stories of balance, of fairness, of giving power back to the people who actually earn it. Applause filled the room. For the first time, it didn't feel like noise, it felt like alignment. Afterward, Jake joined me on the balcony overlooking the river. "You've rebuilt everything they tried to destroy," he said. "How does it feel like freedom?" I said quietly. "But not the kind that comes from money, the kind that comes from peace." He hesitated before asking, "Have you spoken to her?" It took me a moment to answer. "Vanessa." He nodded. "No," I said, "and I don't plan to." But that wasn't entirely true. That night, after everyone left, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a single letter creased from too many readings. Vanessa had sent it from prison 2 weeks earlier. "Claire," it began, "I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know I understand now what I destroyed. I thought power made me untouchable. You proved that it never does. The world calls you a hero. I just call you my mirror. I hate that it took this to see it." There was no apology in the words, but there was something else: recognition. That somehow felt heavier. I folded the letter back into the envelope and locked it away again. Days turned into weeks. The Horizon Initiative spread faster than we could manage. Universities invited me to speak about ethical reform. Government agencies consulted us on new transparency standards. Every headline that once used the word revenge now replaced it with reform. And yet, every time someone congratulated me, I thought of the marble dining room where this all began. The night she'd said those words, "She's just paid help." How that humiliation had been the spark for everything that came after. One evening, I found myself back in Newport for a charity gala, this time as a guest of honor. The irony wasn't lost on me. The ballroom had been remodeled since the collapse of Donovan and Pierce. Gone were the chandeliers and gold accents. The space was now minimal, modern, understated. The new owners had renamed it the Newport Collective, dedicated to hosting nonprofit events. As I stepped onto the same marble floors, I felt the ghost of that night: Vanessa's laugh, the sting of her words, the cameras flashing behind champagne glasses. But this time, the whispers were different. "That's Claire Donovan," someone said. "She's the one who exposed the fraud." "No," another voice replied. "She's the one who rebuilt it right." For the first time, I didn't flinch at the sound of my name. Later that night, as I spoke to the crowd about Horizon's mission, I caught sight of a young woman standing near the back of the room clutching a notepad. She couldn't have been older than 20. After the speech, she approached me, eyes bright with determination. "Miss Donovan," she said, "I'm studying business ethics at NYU. Your story, it's why I changed my major." Her voice trembled slightly, but her smile was steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for proving that success doesn't have to mean compromise." Her words hit me harder than applause ever had. I reached for her hand. "Don't let anyone tell you that kindness and strength can't live in the same room," I said. "They're what keep the walls standing." After she left, I stepped outside into the cold air. The ocean stretched black and endless, just like it had that night. But the wind felt different now, not cruel, not mocking, cleansing. Jake found me there, coat draped over his arm. "You disappeared," he said. "Just needed a minute," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment. "You know, I think you've finally done it. Done what turned revenge into something that actually matters." I laughed softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I just learned to stop mistaking survival for bitterness." We stood in silence for a while, the waves crashing below. When I got home later, a small envelope waited on my doorstep. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. My heart tightened as I tore it open. Claire, it read. "They're transferring me to a lower security facility next month. I don't expect a response. But I wanted you to know that I've started mentoring women here, helping them build financial plans for when they're released. You'd probably call it irony. I call it learning from the best. V." I sat on the steps for a long time, the letter trembling in my hand. Then, without really knowing why, I smiled. Because maybe this was what closure looked like: not forgiveness, not friendship, but understanding. The next morning, I brought the letter to the office and pinned it to my wall next to the first Forbes cover. Not as a trophy, not even as a reminder, but as proof that even broken things could be repurposed into meaning. When Rosa noticed, she tilted her head. "You're keeping that?" "Yes," I said. "Every empire deserves a record of how it fell and how we rose after." Outside, the city was waking up again, the morning light, soft and gold across the skyline. I walked to the window, my reflection layered over Manhattan's endless glass towers. The world had stopped seeing me as the sister who exposed the scandal. Now I was something else entirely. And as I looked out at the city I'd rebuilt from the ashes of my family's greed, I realized the truth. I'd been chasing all along. Revenge fades, but integrity doesn't. It was the only currency that never lost its value. The first spring after the trial came late, slow to thaw through the chill that had settled over everything. But when it arrived, it did so with quiet confidence, buds pushing through the concrete sunlight, filtering through office windows, like a soft reminder that rebuilding was possible. I'd stopped counting the days since Vanessa's conviction. Time had become less about what was lost and more about what was growing in its place. Eco Revive was thriving. The Horizon Initiative had already helped over 100 small businesses secure transparent funding, and every week we were fielding new partnership requests from institutions that had once ignored my calls. Yet the success didn't feel loud. It felt earned. That morning, Rosa burst into my office waving a glossy magazine. "You're not going to believe this," she said, breathless with excitement. I looked up from my laptop as she laid it on my desk. Forbes 100 Most Influential Women of the Year. And there I was again, this time not for wealth, not for scandal, but for impact. The caption under my photo read, "Claire Donovan, redefining capitalism through conscience." I traced the letters with my finger, remembering the first time my name had appeared under their masthead. That cover had been my revenge. This one felt like my redemption. Later that day, Jake called from Austin, where our new branch was opening. "You're all over the news again," he teased. "Can't even step away for a day without you making headlines." "Don't exaggerate," I said, smiling. "How's the launch packed? We've got local entrepreneurs lining up to pitch. You should be here. These people talk about you like you invented sunlight." I laughed, but a quiet part of me warmed at the thought. The girl who'd once been mocked at her sister's dinner table was now being thanked by people who didn't even know the name Donovan. When I hung up, Rosa knocked on the door again. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "She says she's from the Women's Reentry Alliance." A few minutes later, a woman in her 50s stepped in. Her face was lined, but kind, her eyes steady. "Miss Donovan," she said, shaking my hand. "I'm Lydia Perez. I run the education program at the correctional facility in Danbury. Your sister asked me to deliver something." My pulse slowed. "Vanessa." She nodded and handed me a thin folder. Inside were handwritten notes, financial literacy lessons, small business strategies, simple budgeting guides written in Vanessa's neat slanted handwriting. At the top of the first page, "Rebuilding from Zero." Lydia smiled faintly. "She teaches a weekly class for women preparing to leave. Some of them have business ideas but no direction. She's surprisingly good at it." For a long moment I couldn't speak. The version of my sister I'd known, the one driven by power and perfection, felt galaxies away from the woman writing these words. "Thank you," I said finally. Lydia paused at the door. She said one thing to me before I left. "Tell my sister she was right. About everything." When she was gone, I sat at my desk, the folder still open, Vanessa's words spreading across the page like quiet penance. I felt something shift, small but real. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. That evening, I drove out of the city, needing air that wasn't wrapped in glass and ambition. The road led north to the Hudson Valley, where spring had already turned the hillsides green. The Donovan family estate, long seized and resold, now belonged to a nonprofit that hosted leadership retreats for young women. I donated anonymously, though I suspected the board knew. When I arrived, the old gates were gone, replaced with a simple sign, the Harbor Institute for Women in Business and beyond. Inside, the mansion no longer gleamed with marble and chandeliers. The dining hall had been converted into a co-working space filled with laptops, whiteboards, and laughter. The scent of coffee replaced the perfume of my mother's dinner parties. A young woman looked up from her desk. "Can I help you? I used to live here," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "You're her, aren't you, Claire Donovan?" I smiled. "Once upon a time," she grinned. "We read about you in our program. You inspired the entire curriculum here." Her words landed with a weight I didn't expect. I walked through the hall's rooms that had once echoed with my sister's laughter, my parents' judgments, and my own silence. Now they buzzed with life and purpose. The ghosts had been evicted. In what used to be the great dining room, a group of women were gathered around a long table brainstorming business ideas. One was sketching a logo for an eco-friendly cleaning brand. Another was writing projections for a catering company that hired women recently released from prison. Watching them, I realized something powerful. My revenge had never been about destruction, it had been about reclamation, of space, of dignity, of narrative. I left the house as the sun dipped behind the hills, the air warm and heavy, with the scent of blooming lilacs. Before driving away, I looked back one last time. For the first time since I was a child, I felt peace connected to that place, not pain. Back in Manhattan, Jake met me for dinner at a small Italian bistro in Tribeca, the same neighborhood where Vanessa had once humiliated me years ago. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "So," he said, raising his glass, "what's next for the great Claire Donovan?" "Something quieter," I said, smiling. "Maybe mentoring, teaching, helping others find their own way to clean up messes before they become wars." He laughed. "Still housekeeping, huh?" I smirked. "Exactly. Just at a higher level." We toasted, the sound of our glasses soft but satisfying. Later that night, as I walked back through the city, my phone buzzed. A news alert from Forbes. The Horizon Initiative announces partnership with the UN for global microfinance reform. My name was in the subheading again, but this time it didn't feel like validation. It felt like continuity. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the drawer where I kept the framed housekeeper badge from years ago, the one Vanessa had forced on me that night. I lifted it out, tracing the faded letters. Then I placed it beside the new Forbes cover and a copy of her handwritten notes from prison. 3 objects, 3 eras, paid help, power, purpose. They belonged together now. I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and wrote one line before closing it again. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's what you build in others while you're still here. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm: cars, voices, laughter, the hum of a million stories unfolding at once. But for the first time, mine didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a beginning. The day Vanessa was released from prison, the sky over Manhattan was bruised purple with summer thunder. I was in a board meeting when my phone buzzed, a single text from an unknown number. "She's out. No name, no signature." But I didn't need one. I stared at the message for a long time, my pen still in midair. Around me, executives were talking numbers, projections, partnerships, all of it muffled under the sudden static of memory. Vanessa walking through the marble hallway of our childhood home. Vanessa laughing under the chandelier. Vanessa whispering that line. "She's just paid help," as though it were gospel. When the meeting ended, I told Rosa I needed air and left without my umbrella. The rain started almost immediately, warm and relentless, blurring the city into streaks of silver. I didn't know why I was walking or where I was going. I only knew that after years of distance, something inside me was pulling toward closure. By the time I reached the small cafe on Fifth Avenue, I was soaked. A familiar voice called my name, "Claire." I turned, and there she was. Vanessa stood in the doorway, thinner than I remembered, her hair darker, her posture less polished. She wasn't wearing designer anything, just jeans, a gray sweater, and a pair of rain boots that looked borrowed. But her eyes, they were the same. Sharp, assessing, full of old calculation. Only now there was something new behind them, humility, or maybe exhaustion. We stared at each other for several long seconds before she spoke again. "Can we sit inside the cafe?" Smelled like coffee and wet pavement. We found a quiet corner by the window. She folded her hands the same way our mother used to before a confrontation. "You look different," she said finally. "You look human," I replied. A faint smile tugged at her lips, almost genuine. "I suppose I've had time to practice." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain filling the space between us. Then she reached into her bag and placed a small folded paper on the table. "I wanted to give you this." It was a copy of a class photo, Vanessa, standing among a group of women in blue uniforms, all smiling, some holding certificates. The caption on the back read, "Financial Empowerment Program, Danbury Correctional Class of 2028. They graduated last month," she said softly. "I taught them how to open savings accounts, build budgets, apply for microloans. Some of them are starting small businesses now, cleaning services, food trucks, real work." Her voice faltered on those last two words. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," she continued. "I just wanted you to know that I finally understand what you built and why you built it." I traced the edge of the photograph, my chest tight, with a mix of pride and ache. "People can change," I said carefully, "but change doesn't erase what came before." "I know," she whispered, "and I don't want it to." She hesitated before adding, "When I was inside, I kept replaying that night at the gala. How smug I was, how cruel. I thought humiliation would make you small. I didn't realize it would make you infinite." For the first time, I saw tears gather in her eyes, not the kind she used to manufacture for sympathy, real ones. "I hated you for what you did," she said, "but I also needed it. I needed someone to stop me before I burned everything." I leaned back, studying her. "You were always chasing a finish line that didn't exist, Vanessa. Even when you had everything, it was never enough." Her smile was brittle. "And you were always chasing meaning. Looks like we both caught what we were running from." Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. She reached into her pocket and pulled out another object, a small tarnished locket I hadn't seen in years. "Mom's," she said, simply sliding it across the table. "She wanted you to have it before she moved to Florida." I froze. "She's leaving New York. She's different now, quiet. I think she finally realized she can't host dinner parties on ashes." I opened the locket. Inside was a faded photograph, Vanessa and me as children, sitting on the steps of the old estate, laughing, our arms around each other. I hadn't seen that image in decades. For a moment, the world felt heavy and light all at once. "She told me once," Vanessa murmured, "that you reminded her of our father when he was young. Always certain, always searching. He never stopped working, because he was afraid to stop proving himself." I closed the locket gently. Maybe we both inherited that. We sat for a while longer, the rain tapping softly against the window. Then Vanessa stood. "I'm not staying in New York," she said. "I've been offered a position in Chicago financial consulting for nonprofits. It's not glamorous, but it's honest." I nodded. "That's new for you," she smirked faintly. "Prison will do that." At the door, she hesitated. "You know," she said quietly, "the world sees me as the villain and you as the hero. But I think we were both just surviving different cages." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. When she left, I watched her cross the street, disappearing into the blur of umbrellas. For a brief second, I wondered if I'd ever see her again. And then for the first time, I realized I didn't need to. Some stories don't end with reunion. They end with release. Back at the office that evening, the city glowed golden under a clearing sky. Rosa handed me a report, quarterly growth numbers that should have thrilled me. But my mind kept drifting to that photograph, the one from Danbury. I pinned it to the wall beside the others. Forbes covers Horizon Milestones, the framed housekeeper badge. A reminder that redemption could look like many things. When Jake came in, I didn't turn from the window. "She's gone," I said simply. He paused. "Do you feel lighter?" I thought for a moment. "No, just balanced." He nodded, understanding without pressing. "You've done something rare, Claire. You turned vengeance into something useful." I smiled faintly. That's the only kind worth keeping. Later that night, as I walked home, the city was humming with its usual pulse horns, laughter sirens, the endless heartbeat of survival. I passed a bookstore window displaying the new Forbes issue, the headline bold and clean: "Integrity is the new power." Inside, a group of college students stood by the magazine rack pointing at my photo. One of them, a young woman with thick glasses, said softly, "She's why I changed my major." I kept walking, but my chest ached with something tender and fierce. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the glass case in my office. Inside were the 3 artifacts of my journey: the badge, the letter from Vanessa, and the locket. I rearranged them so they stood side by side, each representing a truth: humiliation, resistance, renewal. Then I wrote a note in my journal: before turning off the light, revenge built the fire. Justice forged the steel. But grace, that's what keeps the house standing. Outside, the last drops of rain fell against the glass. Somewhere beyond the skyline, a train horn wailed, carrying one chapter away while another quietly began. The morning sun spilled over the city like melted gold, and for the first time in years, I didn't wake up thinking about war. The headlines, the courtrooms, the family name, all of it had finally drifted into memory like dust settling after a long storm. I brewed coffee in silence, listening to the soft hum of the city below. The air felt different now, lighter, quieter, almost forgiving. On my desk sat the letter Vanessa had sent before leaving for Chicago. "I've started again," she'd written. "Not as a Donovan, just as myself. And it feels strange but good." I ran my fingers over the paper, realizing how far both of us had come from the women we used to be. For the first time, I believed that maybe some things didn't end, they simply evolved. That day was special: 5 years since the launch of the Horizon Initiative. We were holding our anniversary event in the same building where my career had first begun, back when Eco Revive was nothing more than a dream written on a legal pad in a 1-bedroom apartment. Rosa had spent weeks planning every detail, and when I arrived, the lobby was unrecognizable. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of small businesses that had survived, grown, and thrived because of the programs we'd built. 2,000 jobs created, 1,000 loans repaid in full, and 0 lawsuits, Rosa said proudly as she handed me the event folder. "I'd say that's a clean record," I smiled. "Not bad for a company they once called a hobby." The auditorium filled quickly: founders, students, journalists, and families. The hum of conversation rose like a heartbeat. I stood at the edge of the stage for a moment, watching the crowd, feeling a weight I hadn't realized I still carried begin to lift. Jake joined me, adjusting his tie. "They're all waiting for you," he said. "Funny," I whispered. For most of my life, I was the one waiting to be seen. When the lights dimmed, I stepped into the spotlight. Applause echoed through the room, but it wasn't the noise that moved me, it was the faces. Real people, lives rebuilt, futures redirected. 5 years ago I began. This wasn't a company, it was a rebellion. A rebellion against greed, against manipulation, against the idea that success must come at someone else's expense. Today, Horizon isn't just about business, it's about trust. It's about giving back what the world took from people who were told they didn't belong. Behind me, the screen lit up with photos. Women opening storefronts, men standing proudly beside delivery vans, families gathered in newly opened restaurants. The audience was silent, the kind of silence that feels sacred. I took a breath. For a long time, I thought revenge was the only way to reclaim power. But revenge is fire, it burns fast and leaves you standing in ashes. What matters is what you build after the flames die. The applause this time was thunderous. But I wasn't done. When I was younger, I worked for people who believed money was the only language worth speaking. Now I've learned that integrity speaks louder. You can't cash it, but it will keep your soul solvent. After the event, people lined up to shake my hand, to tell their stories, to thank me. I smiled. I listened, but my eyes kept drifting toward the last row where a familiar figure stood quiet and still. Vanessa. She didn't approach the stage. She just smiled faintly, one hand pressed over her heart, the other holding a small notebook. Then when our eyes met, she mouthed the words, "I'm proud of you." It was enough. Later, when the crowd had gone, I found a note on my chair, her handwriting unmistakable. "Don't worry, I didn't stay long. I just needed to see what you've built. It's beautiful, Claire. Keep building." I folded it carefully and slipped it into my pocket. That evening, Jake and I walked through the city, passing the old Donovan and Pierce building. It was now the headquarters of a community investment bank, a Horizon partner. The marble facade was the same, but the name engraved across it read, "The Nexus Trust." I ran my fingers over the letters. The irony wasn't lost on me. The house that had once symbolized greed now stood for transparency. Jake looked at me. "Do you ever miss it? The fight?" I shook my head. "No. You can't miss what you've already transformed." We kept walking past the river, past the bridges, glowing with city light. The air smelled of summer rain and something cleaner possibility. When I got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, the skyline glittering like an old friend. On my wall hung the framed relics of my journey, the housekeeper badge, the first Forbes cover, Vanessa's prison letter, and now a new photo. The Horizon anniversary crowd, hundreds of faces lit by belief. For a moment I closed my eyes and replayed it all. The humiliation, the fear, the fire, the triumph. I'd spent years fighting to prove that worth couldn't be inherited, and now I didn't have to fight anymore. My existence was proof enough. I thought of my younger self, the girl who used to hide in her sister's shadow, who believed power was something you had to take. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this power isn't taken. It's built brick by brick through integrity and grit. The phone buzzed, an email from Forbes. "We'd like to feature you in our legacy issue, 10 Women Who Changed the Face of Modern Business." I laughed softly. Not out of pride, but gratitude. Life had come full circle, but this time I wasn't walking into the spotlight for revenge. I was walking into it to shine light outward. Before bed, I opened my journal, its pages nearly full. I wrote one final entry. "Legacy isn't what survives you. It's what grows because of you." My sister taught me ambition. Pain taught me purpose. But truth taught me peace. I paused, then added one last line. "If you've ever been dismissed, diminished, or told you don't belong, remember your worth isn't defined by who sees it. It's defined by what you create when no one's watching." When I set the pen down, the city lights flickered like applause outside my window. I smiled, whispered into the quiet, "The house is clean now." And maybe it was. Not spotless, not perfect, but clean in the way that mattered most. The kind of clean that comes after years of burning, rebuilding, and forgiving not them but myself. As I turned off the lamp, the skyline shimmered in reflection, gold and steady. Tomorrow would bring new storms, new struggles, new beginnings. But for tonight, for once, I let myself rest. If you're still here listening to my story, thank you. Tell me yours. Tell me when you stood up, when you rebuilt, when you refused to stay small. Because that's how we keep this alive. Like every act of defiance that turned into legacy. Like every woman who finally learned revenge ends but resilience never does.